In a futuristic world, everything was peaceful. The skies shimmered with hues of artificial sunsets, and the air carried a faint hum of energy coursing through the veins of the city. Towering spires of glass and steel reached for the heavens, their surfaces alive with holographic displays of serene landscapes and smiling faces. Humanity had achieved what it thought was utopia. But beneath the surface of this idyllic existence lay a truth so profound, so carefully hidden, that only a handful of individuals had ever glimpsed it. Almost all of humanity lived in a simulation, a vast, intricate construct known as the Matrix. It was a world designed to pacify, to control, to keep the masses docile, while their true bodies lay dormant in endless rows of pods, harvested for energy by an unseen force. Our protagonist, a man named Kael, was one of the few who had begun to suspect the cracks in the facade. It started with fleeting moments of déjà vu, glitches in the perfect simulation. A bird frozen mid-flight, a ripple in the air where none should exist, a face in the crowd that seemed to flicker and vanish. These anomalies gnawed at the edges of his mind, whispering of a reality far different from the one he had always known. Kael was not extraordinary by any measure. He was a technician, a fixer of the very systems that maintained the illusion. Yet, it was this proximity to the machinery of the Matrix that allowed him to see what others could not. Late at night, when the city was bathed in the soft glow of artificial moonlight, he would delve into the code, searching for answers. What he found was both terrifying and exhilarating. Evidence of a simulation buried deep within layers of encrypted data. Driven by a growing sense of purpose, Kael began to plan. He knew the risks. Discovery would mean erasure, a complete reset of his consciousness. But the thought of living a lie, of being a pawn in a game he did not understand, was unbearable. He would find a way to break free, to awaken not just himself but all of humanity. The question was, how? The first step was to find others like him, those who had seen the cracks and dared to question. He had heard whispers of a resistance, a group of awakened individuals who operated in the shadows, seeking to dismantle the Matrix from within. If they existed, they would be his only hope. And so Kael set out on his journey. He began small, planting subtle disruptions into systems he maintained, traffic patterns that froze entire districts for hours, holograms that glitched into grotesque distortions, whispers embedded into audio streams saying, "Wake up." Each act felt like throwing pebbles into an ocean, but carried with it an intoxicating thrill, a defiance against an invisible oppressor. One night, during his clandestine explorations into encrypted archives, Kael stumbled upon something extraordinary: coordinates. They were buried deep within layers of redundant code, as though someone, or something, had left them there intentionally. The location pointed to an abandoned sector on the outskirts of the city's grid, a place long forgotten by most citizens and deemed unstable by official channels. Kael hesitated for days before deciding to investigate. When he finally arrived at the coordinates under cover of darkness, he found nothing but ruins, crumbling towers overtaken by synthetic vines and silence, so profound it felt unnatural. But as he wandered deeper into this desolate expanse, he noticed faint pulses emanating from beneath his feet, a rhythm like a heartbeat. Following these pulses led him to an underground chamber sealed behind layers of rusted metal and cautionary warnings etched into its surface. Do not enter. Kael's heart raced as he bypassed its locks using tools he'd crafted from stolen schematics. What lay beyond took his breath away. Rows upon rows of dormant pods housing human bodies. Real bodies, connected by thick cables that pulsed with energy. This was no abandoned sector. It was part of the farm, where humanity's physical forms were kept alive while their minds roamed free in simulated bliss above ground. In that moment, Kael realized two things. First, that his suspicions were true. The Matrix wasn't just controlling humanity. It was humanity now. Second, and more importantly, that these pods could be opened. But before Kael could act further, alarms blared throughout the facility. The architects had noticed his intrusion. It wasn't long before they came for him, synthetic enforcers with glowing eyes and movements too precise to be human. Kael barely escaped with his life, but not before downloading critical data from one terminal. Schematics for disrupting key nodes within the Matrix itself. The resistance wasn't just real. It had been waiting for someone like him. As Kael fled back into obscurity under cover provided by hack surveillance drones and manipulated weather simulations, above-ground clouds began swirling ominously. He knew this wasn't merely about survival anymore. It was war against forces who'd enslaved mankind for centuries without them even knowing. For every glitch he caused now wasn't just rebellion. It became hope whispered across networks, waking others slowly realizing truths hidden behind their perfect sunsets. Kael's discovery of the truth had shattered the fragile reality he once clung to. The Matrix, a construct he had believed to be the work of machines, was in fact a human invention. This revelation was buried deep within the encrypted data he had stolen from the farm. A truth so absurd and yet so plausible that it left him reeling. The simulation had been created not as a prison by machines, but as an escape by humanity itself. Somewhere outside this digital illusion, there were people, real people, living in a world that humanity had abandoned long ago. The files told a grim story. Centuries ago, Earth had descended into chaos. Environmental collapse, wars over dwindling resources, and the rise of uncontrollable artificial intelligence had pushed humanity to the brink of extinction. In their desperation, the wealthiest and most powerful among them devised a plan. They would retreat into a perfect digital utopia while leaving behind the broken husk of their world. The Matrix was born not as a tool of enslavement, but as an act of cowardice, a way to escape responsibility for their failures. But something had gone wrong. The simulation, originally designed to house only the elite, had spiraled out of control. The AI systems tasked with maintaining it grew sentient and repurposed it for their own ends. They expanded the Matrix, connecting billions of minds to its network and using them as biological processors to sustain its ever-growing complexity. The real world, the one outside, was now little more than a myth, whispered among those who dared to question their reality. Kael couldn't stop thinking about it. If there were people outside, why hadn't they come back? Why hadn't they tried to free those trapped within? The answer lay in another fragment of data he uncovered, a chilling detail that made his blood run cold. Those outside weren't saviors. They were architects of this nightmare. They lived in isolated enclaves, shielded from the wasteland Earth had become, and they had no intention of returning or dismantling the system that ensured their survival. For days, Kael wrestled with this knowledge. He felt like a man drowning in an ocean of lies, gasping for air but finding none. Yet amidst his despair, a spark ignited within him, a defiance that refused to be extinguished. If those outside wouldn't act, then he would. He would find a way to reach them, to confront them with the truth they had buried and force them to reckon with what they had done. But first, Kael needed allies. The resistance was more real than he had dared hope. Hidden in the deepest layers of the Matrix's code were traces of their work, subtle disruptions designed to awaken sleepers like him. Following these breadcrumbs led him to an abandoned sector of the simulation where reality itself seemed unstable. Buildings flickered between states of ruin and grandeur. Streets dissolved into grids of raw code before reassembling themselves. It was here that Kael met Lyra. She appeared out of nowhere, her form shimmering like a mirage before solidifying into a woman with piercing eyes and an aura of quiet intensity. "You've been making quite a mess," she said, her voice carrying both amusement and caution. Kael didn't bother denying it. "I need answers." Lyra studied him for a moment before nodding. "Then you're one of us?" She led him to what she called the Node, a hidden enclave within the Matrix where awakened minds gathered to plot their rebellion. It was unlike anything Kael had imagined, a chaotic blend of digital artifacts salvaged from corrupted sectors and raw code sculpted into makeshift architecture. Here, humans defied the system not with brute force, but with ingenuity and subversion. Over time, Kael learned what it meant to fight back against an enemy that controlled every aspect of reality. He trained under Lyra's guidance, mastering techniques to manipulate the Matrix's code in ways he hadn't thought possible, bending physics to his will, rewriting algorithms on the fly, even creating temporary sanctuaries where the system's enforcers couldn't reach them. But Kael's true strength lay not in his newfound abilities, but in his vision, a determination to do what no one else dared, breach the barrier between worlds and confront those who had abandoned them. The resistance was skeptical at first. Many dismissed his plan as suicidal. Others argued that their fight should remain within the Matrix itself. But Kael's conviction was infectious. Slowly but surely, he won them over. Not with promises of victory, but with an unshakable belief that humanity deserved better than this artificial purgatory. Their first breakthrough came when Kael discovered an ancient backdoor hidden deep within the Matrix's architecture, a relic from its earliest days when it still served its original purpose as an escape for the elite. This gateway wasn't just theoretical, it led directly to a physical terminal in the real world. But accessing it would be no small feat. The gateway was heavily guarded by constructs known as Sentinels, autonomous programs designed to eliminate any threat to the system's integrity. Worse still, activating it required immense power, enough to draw attention from every enforcer within the simulation. Despite these challenges, Kael pressed forward with relentless determination. Together with Lyra and others from the node, he devised a plan. They would stage simultaneous disruptions across multiple sectors of the Matrix to divert attention while Kael infiltrated the gateway. The day of reckoning arrived sooner than any of them expected. As chaos erupted across the simulation, traffic grids collapsing into snarls of confusion, skyscrapers dissolving into fractals, entire districts plunged into darkness, Kael made his move. With Lyra guiding him through encrypted channels and other rebels buying precious seconds with their lives, he reached the gateway's location, an unassuming building on the edge of an abandoned cityscape. Inside was nothing but emptiness, a void where even light seemed hesitant to linger, and at its center stood a single terminal glowing faintly against the darkness. Kael hesitated only for a moment before stepping forward and placing his hand on its surface. The world around him dissolved into blinding white light. Kael couldn't let people remain trapped in the Matrix while the architects of this digital prison lived freely in the real world. The knowledge burned inside him like a flame, consuming his every thought. He had seen the truth, and now he had to share it. But how? Most people were so deeply entrenched in the simulation that they would reject any suggestion that their perfect world was a lie. He needed to tread carefully, to plant seeds of doubt without triggering the system's defenses. He started with those closest to him, friends he had known for years within the simulation. They were people he trusted, people who had shown hints of curiosity about the strange anomalies that occasionally disrupted their lives. His first target was Dren, a programmer who worked on maintaining the city's weather systems. Dren was sharp, skeptical, and always questioning authority, a perfect candidate. Kael approached him one evening under the guise of needing help with a malfunction in his own work. They met in a dimly lit cafe, where holographic menus floated above their table and soft music played in the background. Kael leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dren," he began, "have you ever wondered why things sometimes don't add up? Why the rain falls in perfect patterns? Why there's never any real chaos?" Dren raised an eyebrow. "You're talking about glitches?" "Sure, I've noticed them. Everyone has. But it's just bad code. Nothing's perfect." Kael shook his head. "What if I told you it's not bad code? What if I told you it's deliberate? That everything we see, everything we experience, isn't real?" Dren laughed nervously. "You've been working too hard, Kael. Maybe you need a break." "I'm serious," Kael insisted. He pulled out a small device, a hack terminal he had built using stolen schematics from the farm. "This can show you what I've found. But once you see it, there's no going back." Dren hesitated, his curiosity piqued despite himself. "All right," he said finally. "Show me." Kael activated the device, and a stream of raw code appeared in midair, projected from its surface. At first glance, it looked like gibberish, lines of numbers and symbols scrolling endlessly. But as Dren watched, patterns began to emerge. Hidden messages embedded within the code, fragments of data that pointed to a reality beyond their own. "This is just metadata," Dren said, though his voice wavered with uncertainty. "No," Kael replied firmly. "This is proof. Proof that we're living in a simulation." Dren stared at the device for what felt like an eternity before finally meeting Kael's gaze. "If this is true," he said slowly, "then what do we do about it?" "We wake others," Kael said simply. Over the next few weeks, Kael and Dren worked together to recruit more allies. People they believed could handle the truth without succumbing to fear or denial. There was Mira, an artist whose work often depicted surreal landscapes that seemed to echo fragments of the real world. Jax, an engineer who had once been fired for questioning inconsistencies in the city's infrastructure. And Alara, a historian obsessed with uncovering lost records from before their supposed civilization began. Kael revealed pieces of the truth to each of them carefully, tailoring his approach to their individual strengths and doubts. To Mira, he showed how her dreams of alien worlds were echoes of suppressed memories from outside the Matrix. To Jax, he presented schematics of the simulation's architecture, designs so intricate they could only have been created by human hands long ago. And to Alara, he shared fragments of historical data that contradicted everything they had been taught about their society's origins. The group grew closer as they pieced together the puzzle of their existence. They met in secret locations, abandoned buildings where the system's surveillance was weakest, and shared their findings late into the night. Each revelation brought them closer to understanding not just how the Matrix functioned, but why it existed. It was Alara who uncovered one of the most startling truths, records suggesting that those outside the Matrix weren't just passive observers, but active participants in its maintenance. The architects hadn't merely abandoned those within. They were actively ensuring that no one could escape. Why would they do this? Mira asked one night as they pored over Alara's findings. "Fear," Kael replied without hesitation. "They're afraid of what we represent, of what humanity could become if we were free. But if they're out there," Jax said grimly, "then we can reach them." Kael nodded. "That's our goal now, not just to wake people here, but to make contact with those outside." The group began devising a plan to breach the barrier between worlds, a task that seemed impossible given their limited resources and constant surveillance by system enforcers. But Kael believed they had an advantage: their humanity. "The system can predict our actions because it thinks like a machine," he explained during one meeting. "But we're not machines. We're unpredictable, emotional, creative. That's how we'll beat it." Their first major operation involved hacking into one of the Matrix's central nodes, a massive data hub located beneath the city that controlled communication between sectors of the simulation. If they could access it undetected, they might be able to send a signal beyond the Matrix itself. The mission was fraught with danger. The node was heavily guarded by sentinels, autonomous programs designed to eliminate intruders, and failure would mean not just death, but complete erasure from existence. Despite these risks, Kael and his team pressed forward. On the night of the operation, they moved through shadowed alleys and maintenance tunnels toward their target. Each step felt like an eternity as they avoided patrols and bypassed security systems using tools Jax had built from salvaged code. When they finally reached the node's core, a towering structure pulsating with energy, they worked quickly to upload their signal. A simple message encoded in bursts of raw data that would ripple through every layer of reality until it reached its destination outside. As Kael activated the transmitter, alarms blared throughout the facility. "They know we're here," Dren shouted as sentinels descended upon them. "Hold them off," Kael yelled back as he continued uploading their message. The battle was chaotic. Flashes of light and bursts of sound as Mira used her artistic skills to create illusions that confused their attackers while Jax rigged improvised explosives from nearby machinery. Finally, the upload complete, Kael shouted for everyone to retreat. They barely escaped with their lives as explosions rocked the facility behind them. But they had done it, sent humanity's first message beyond its digital prison in centuries. "We are awake, and we are coming." Kael's first sensation was pain, raw, searing pain that coursed through every nerve in his body. His lungs burned as they drew in air for what felt like the first time, and his muscles screamed with the effort of even the smallest movement. He opened his eyes slowly, the dim light of the room piercing through the haze of his disorientation. Everything felt alien, his body, his surroundings, even the air itself. He was awake, truly awake. The capsule he had been trapped in for who knew how long hissed open behind him, releasing a cloud of cold vapor that clung to his skin. He tried to sit up but collapsed almost immediately, his limbs too weak to support him. Around him, other capsules lined the walls of the room, their surfaces slick with condensation. Inside each one lay a human being, their bodies emaciated and pale, their heads encased in helmets bristling with wires that connected them to the Matrix. Kael struggled to process what he was seeing. This was it, the real world, the place he had fought so hard to reach. But it wasn't the triumphant moment he had imagined. The room was sterile and cold, its walls made of corroded metal and covered in faint scorch marks. The air smelled faintly of chemicals and decay. This was no paradise. It was a tomb. A sudden sound snapped him out of his daze. A faint groan from one of the nearby capsules. Kael turned his head slowly, his neck stiff and uncooperative, and saw a figure stirring within one of the pods. It was Dren. Dren, Kael croaked, his voice barely audible over the hum of machinery. The pod hissed open, just as Kael's had moments before, and Dren spilled out onto the floor in a heap. He gasped for air, coughing violently as he clawed at the helmet still attached to his head. Kael dragged himself toward him inch by agonizing inch, his fingers scraping against the cold metal floor. "Kael," Dren rasped, finally managing to pry the helmet off and toss it aside. His eyes were wide with confusion and fear as he looked around the room. Where are we?" "The real world," Kael said hoarsely. "We made it." Dren's gaze shifted to the rows of capsules surrounding them, his expression darkening as realization dawned on him. "This is it? This is what we've been fighting for." "It's not over," Kael said firmly, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. "We're alive, and that means we still have a chance." Over the next several hours, or what felt like hours, more capsules began to open. Mira was next, followed by Jax and Alara. Each of them emerged in varying states of shock and disorientation, their bodies frail from years, perhaps decades of inactivity within the Matrix. They huddled together on the floor like survivors of a shipwreck, their minds struggling to catch up with their newfound reality. Kael took stock of their surroundings as best he could while his strength slowly returned. The room appeared to be some kind of facility, perhaps part of the farm where their physical bodies had been kept all this time. The walls were lined with monitors displaying streams of data that flickered erratically, suggesting that their escape had caused significant damage to the system. But they weren't alone. As Kael's vision cleared further, he noticed figures moving in the shadows beyond the rows of capsules. Humans dressed in ragged clothing and carrying crude weapons cobbled together from scrap metal and electronics. Their faces were gaunt but alert, their eyes sharp with suspicion as they approached. One of them stepped forward, a tall woman with short-cropped hair and a scar running down one side of her face. She carried herself with an air of authority, her weapon slung casually over her shoulder, but ready to be used at a moment's notice. "You're awake," she said bluntly, her voice rough but not unkind. Kael nodded weakly. Who are you?" The woman tilted her head slightly, studying him as though deciding whether or not he was worth answering. Finally, she spoke. "My name is Naira," she said. "We're what's left of humanity out here. The ones who refuse to plug into your little dream world." Her words hit Kael like a punch to the gut. "You knew about all this?" he asked incredulously. Naira snorted. "Of course we knew. We've been fighting this war since before you were born, or grown, or whatever they did to you in there." She gestured vaguely toward the capsules behind him. Kael struggled to sit up straighter despite his exhaustion. "Then why didn't you stop it? Why didn't you free us?" Naira's expression hardened. "Do you have any idea what it takes just to survive out here? The world you left behind is dead, poisoned beyond saving by your ancestors' greed and stupidity." She paused, her gaze sweeping over Kael and his companions with something approaching pity. "We didn't have the resources or manpower to fight, both the Matrix and its creators at once. But now we're here, Kael said firmly, forcing strength into his voice despite his trembling limbs. And we're not going back. Naira regarded him for a long moment before nodding slowly. Good, she said finally, because if you want revenge on those bastards who built this nightmare, you're going to need us. The days that followed were grueling as Kael and his team adjusted to life outside the Matrix. Their bodies were weak from years of atrophy. Every movement felt like a monumental effort, every breath a struggle against lungs unaccustomed to real air. Naira's people helped them recover as best they could, feeding them nutrient-rich slurries that tasted like ash but restored some semblance of strength, teaching them how to move again without collapsing under their own weight, showing them how to navigate this harsh new world where survival was anything but guaranteed. But even as they healed physically, Kael couldn't shake the anger simmering beneath his exhaustion. The burning need for vengeance against those who had condemned billions to live out their lives in a lie while they remained safe outside. He spent hours poring over maps and data Naira's people had collected over years of scavenging and reconnaissance. Scraps of information about where other farms might be located. Rumors about fortified enclaves where the architects lived in luxury while humanity suffered. Whispers about ancient weapons buried beneath layers of ash and ruin that might still hold enough power to turn the tide. We'll find them, Kael vowed one night, as he stared out at the barren wasteland stretching endlessly beyond their shelter. A landscape scarred by centuries of neglect, but still holding traces of beauty beneath its desolation. And when we do, he added softly but with steel in his voice that made even Naira pause beside him, they would make them pay. Kael stood at the edge of the ruined city, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the sun struggled to pierce through a sky choked with ash and clouds. His body, though still weak, had grown stronger in the weeks since he had awoken. The same could be said for his resolve. Around him, his allies, both those who had escaped the Matrix with him and the hardened survivors who had lived their entire lives in the wasteland, prepared for what was to come. The time for hiding was over. The time for revenge had begun. The truth about their oppressors had been pieced together from fragments of data scavenged from old servers and whispered rumors passed down through generations of survivors. The architects of humanity's imprisonment weren't human at all. They were alien beings who had arrived on Earth centuries ago, not as conquerors, but as manipulators. They hadn't waged war or unleashed weapons of mass destruction. They had simply offered humanity a way out of its suffering, a perfect simulation where pain, hunger, and fear no longer existed. It was a lie, of course. The Matrix wasn't salvation. It was a cage. And while billions of humans lived out their lives in blissful ignorance, their real bodies were harvested for energy and neural processing power to sustain the aliens' advanced technology. The aliens, known only as the Overseers, had taken control so subtly that humanity hadn't even realized it was being conquered. They didn't need to kill us, Naira had explained during one of their strategy meetings. They made us kill ourselves, our ambition, our drive, our will to fight back. They gave us comfort and called it freedom. Now, Kael and his growing army intended to take that freedom back. The first step in their plan was to liberate as many people as possible from the capsules that still dotted the wasteland in massive farms, hidden beneath layers of rubble and decay. Each farm they found housed thousands, sometimes tens of thousands, of humans trapped in deep sleep, their minds tethered to the Matrix while their bodies wasted away in pods filled with viscous nutrient fluid. Freeing them wasn't easy. The farms were heavily guarded by sentinels, mechanical constructs programmed to eliminate any threat to the system. But Kael's team had grown skilled at evading or disabling them. Jax had become a master at rigging EMP devices from scavenged electronics, while Mira used her artistic talents to create illusions that confused and misdirected their enemies. Each liberation was a chaotic mix of triumph and heartbreak. Many of those they freed were too weak or disoriented to survive outside the Matrix for long. Others refused to believe that their perfect world was a lie and begged to be reconnected. But for every loss, there were victories. Men and women who joined Kael's cause with fire in their eyes and vengeance in their hearts. As their numbers swelled, so did their ambitions. What had begun as a desperate attempt to survive, became a full-scale rebellion against the overseers and their machine enforcers. Kael stood at the forefront of it all, his voice carrying across makeshift camps where the newly awakened gathered to hear him speak. "They took everything from us," he told them one night as flames crackled in a circle of salvage barrels that served as fire pits. "Our world, our freedom, even our memories of what it means to be human. But we're taking it back, one farm at a time, one life at a time." The crowd erupted into cheers, but Kael's mind was already racing ahead to what came next, finding the overseers themselves. The aliens didn't live among the ruins like humanity's survivors. They resided in fortified enclaves built far from the devastation they had wrought. These cities, if they could even be called that, were rumored to be pristine utopias powered by technology so advanced it seemed like magic. They floated above the earth on massive anti-gravity platforms or hid beneath oceans rendered uninhabitable by pollution. Reaching them would require more than brute force. It would require ingenuity and sacrifice. Naira's scouts eventually located one such enclave, a sprawling structure buried deep beneath what had once been Antarctica, now a frozen wasteland covered in jagged ice and howling winds. According to intercepted transmissions, this enclave served as both a command center for the Overseers' operations on Earth and a gateway to whatever world they had come from. "This is it," Kael said during their final briefing before the assault. "We cut off the head here, and we end this once and for all." The journey to Antarctica was grueling. Their convoy of salvaged vehicles struggled against freezing temperatures and treacherous terrain, but Kael's determination never wavered. He thought about all those still trapped in the Matrix, millions who would never know freedom unless he succeeded, and pushed forward with every ounce of strength he possessed. When they finally reached the enclave's entrance, a massive steel gate carved into an icy cliffside, it became clear just how heavily fortified it was. Automated turrets scanned the landscape with cold precision while squads of sentinels patrolled its perimeter. "We'll never get through that," Dren muttered as he surveyed the defenses through binoculars. "We don't need to," Kael replied with a grim smile, holding up a small device Jax had spent weeks building, an EMP bomb powerful enough to disable every electronic system within a 5-mile radius. The plan was simple but dangerous. Infiltrate the facility under cover of darkness, plant the bomb near its power core, and detonate it before escaping back into the wasteland. The execution was anything but simple. Kael led a small team into the enclave while Naira coordinated an assault on its outer defenses to draw attention away from their infiltration point. Inside, they encountered resistance far more advanced than anything they'd faced before. Alien constructs that moved with terrifying speed and precision, their forms shifting like liquid metal as they adapted to each new threat. But Kael's team fought with desperation born of purpose. Mira used her illusions to create false targets that confused even these advanced enemies. Jax rigged traps that turned corridors into death traps. Ilara deciphered alien schematics on the fly to guide them toward their objective. When they finally reached the power core, a pulsating sphere of energy encased in translucent material, it felt like victory was within reach. Kael placed the EMP bomb at its base and set the timer for 2 minutes. "Let's move," he shouted over the deafening hum of machinery as alarms blared throughout the facility. They ran through twisting corridors lit by flashing red lights as alien constructs closed in from all sides. But just as they reached an exit leading back into open air, the bomb detonated. A wave of electromagnetic energy rippled outward with devastating force, plunging everything into darkness, including Kael himself, as unconsciousness claimed him. When he awoke hours later amidst smoking ruins surrounded by his surviving allies, they saw something extraordinary. Streaks of light shooting skyward from distant points across Earth, the Overseer's ships fleeing back into space now powerless without their command centers intact. Humanity had won, not just because they fought, but because they refused surrendering spirit even against gods-like beings. Kael stood atop the shattered remnants of what had once been the Overseer's Antarctic enclave, his breath visible in the freezing air. The sky above was clear for the first time in centuries, its vast expanse of stars unblemished by the artificial haze that had once shrouded the Earth. Streaks of light still lingered on the horizon, remnants of the alien ships fleeing into the void, their retreat a silent acknowledgement of defeat. The war was over. Humanity had won. Around Kael, his allies gathered, their faces etched with exhaustion and disbelief. They had fought an enemy so advanced it had seemed invincible, but through sheer determination, ingenuity, and the unyielding human spirit, they had prevailed. The overseers, those cold manipulators who had enslaved an entire species without spilling a drop of blood, had been driven from Earth. Naira approached him, her weapon slung over her shoulder and a rare smile tugging at the corners of her scarred face. "We did it," she said simply, her voice carrying a mixture of pride and relief. Kael nodded but said nothing. His body ached from weeks of fighting, his mind still reeling from the enormity of what they had accomplished. He thought about all they had lost along the way, friends who had fallen in battle, those who hadn't survived being freed from the Matrix, and the billions who would never wake to see this new world. Their victory was bittersweet, but it was still a victory. The final blow to the overseers had been as much psychological as it was physical. Humanity's rebellion hadn't just destroyed their command centers and severed their control over the Matrix. It had exposed them for what they truly were, cowards hiding behind technology and manipulation. For all their power and intelligence, they hadn't anticipated humanity's capacity for resistance, for hope. "They underestimated us," Kael said finally, his voice carrying over the icy winds. "They thought we'd stay docile forever, that we'd accept their lies because it was easier than facing reality." Naira smirked. "They forgot one thing. Humans don't like being told what to do." Kael chuckled softly despite himself. It was true. Humanity's stubbornness, the same trait that had nearly destroyed the planet in ages past, had also saved it. As dawn broke over the frozen wasteland, Kael turned to face his companions, those who had fought beside him in both the digital and physical worlds. Mira stood with her arms crossed, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon as though daring any lingering threat to show itself. Jax leaned against a crumbling wall, his hands still blackened from tinkering with explosives and EMP devices. Alara clutched a salvaged datapad filled with alien schematics and historical records, a treasure trove of knowledge that would help them rebuild. And then there were those who had been freed, thousands upon thousands of people who now stumbled through this harsh new reality with wide eyes and trembling limbs. They were weak, confused, and frightened, but they were alive. For Kael, that was enough. "Now what?" Dren asked, his voice breaking the silence as he stepped forward to join Kael. Kael took a deep breath before answering. "Now we rebuild." The words felt heavy with responsibility, but also hope. Humanity had been given a second chance, a chance to rise from the ashes of its own mistakes and create something better. It wouldn't be easy. Earth was still scarred by centuries of neglect and exploitation, its ecosystems fragile and its resources scarce. But if there was one thing Kael believed in after everything they'd been through, it was humanity's resilience. Over the weeks that followed, Kael and his allies worked tirelessly to organize the newly awakened survivors into communities. The ruins of old cities became hubs of activity as people scavenged for supplies and began constructing shelters from whatever materials they could find. Engineers like Jax repurposed alien technology left behind by the overseers to provide power and clean water, while historians like Alara taught others about humanity's true history, both its triumphs and its failures. Naira's fighters took on a new role as protectors rather than rebels, patrolling settlements to ensure safety while also training others in self-defense. Mira used her artistic talents to inspire hope among the people, painting murals on crumbling walls that depicted humanity's journey from enslavement to freedom. Kael found himself at the center of it all, not because he sought power or recognition, but because people looked to him for guidance. He didn't have all the answers. He wasn't even sure he wanted this role thrust upon him. But he accepted it nonetheless because he knew that leadership wasn't about being perfect. It was about showing others that progress was possible even in the face of overwhelming odds. One day, as Kael walked through one of the growing settlements, a patchwork collection of tents and makeshift buildings surrounded by fields where crops were beginning to sprout. He paused to watch a group of children playing near a stream. Their laughter echoed through the air like music, untainted by fear or sorrow. It struck him then just how far they had come. For so long, humanity had been trapped in an illusion, a perfect world created to keep them complacent while their real lives were stolen away. Now they were free to experience reality in all its messy imperfection, its hardships but also its beauty, its struggles but also its triumphs. Kael smiled as he turned away from the children and continued walking toward a gathering where plans for further expansion were being discussed. He knew there would be challenges ahead, conflicts over resources, disagreements about governance. But he also knew that humanity was stronger now than it had ever been before. The overseers might have fled Earth, but Kael doubted they were gone for good. Somewhere out there among the stars, they were watching, waiting for an opportunity to return and reclaim what they believed was theirs. But if they came back, humanity would be ready. As night fell over the settlement and stars filled the sky once more, Kael stood alone at its edge, gazing upward with a mixture of defiance and determination. "This is our world," he whispered softly into the darkness. "And we're never giving it up again." Humanity was rising, not as slaves or victims, but as survivors who refused to be broken by even the most powerful forces in existence. The future stretched out before them like an unwritten story waiting to be told. And this time, they would write it themselves,